Maybe one of the best structures you can use in your presentation is story structure. And I want to share with you today how story structure could work in telling us about your research or the work that you're doing. So, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, my background is in modern literature. That's my degree. And I'm a specialist in Joycean studies. That's the study of the work of James Joyce, the Irish writer who wrote some amazingly strange books. Perhaps the most well-known of them might be the book Ulysses. And when my advisor invited me to consider doing my thesis on the work of James Joyce and consider doing something from Ulysses, I said, oh, well, all right, I'm curious, I'll look at it. So I went and did a little bit of background, and one of the first things I found out about this book is that nobody can read it. And I thought, well, what does that mean, and nobody can read it? So I sat down, and I got the book, and I sat down, and I opened to the first page, and I started reading. And second page, third page. And as I got into about 10 pages, I realized I couldn't read it. So I went back to my advisor and I said, sir, I'm sorry, I don't want to reject your idea, but I don't think this is possible. I can't get into it. I kind of lied, as I couldn't understand it. But I didn't want to say that because I'm a literature scholar, and it's very embarrassing to say you don't understand English, right, that you're reading in here, modern English literature. Well, he didn't take no for an answer. He suggested that I go back and try reading it again. And that's all he says. Go back and try again. Don't give up. And so, okay, I went back, and I have this picture of me. I'm lying, it's a weekend. I'm lying in my bed, it's Sunday. And it's a beautiful sunny day outside, and thinking maybe I should go out and do something. But no, I thought, no, I should probably read some of Ulysses. So I opened this book, and I started reading again, and I got to page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, around the same time. And I said, no, I can't read it. It's just not possible. I can't penetrate this book. It's so filled with detail. It's got so many references to it. And so I thought, all right, wait a minute. And I got all the reference books that I had on this book. There are hundreds of them. And I got all the reference books that explain all the references and all the language and all of the meaning of what he's talking about. So as I'm reading each page, I'm looking at that and I'm checking this and checking that and checking, oh, that's what that means, okay. And it takes me about 3 hours to read one page. This isn't working. So I'm very frustrated. And but I don't know what else to do because I don't know what else I was going to study. And my advisor said that I would really love this book. And I couldn't imagine why he thought I would love it. Well, as I'm lying there in bed, I'm looking up, and I have something a little unusual hanging on the wall of my bedroom. I have this hanging on the wall of my bedroom. It's a Thangka. It's a Tibetan Buddhist, Tantric Buddhist painting, right? And if you know anything about these, you know that you're supposed to, these are usually hung up in a special place, and you sit down and you meditate on these, right? And they have all sorts of different deities. This is the Kala Chakra, the Lord of Time. And I had that, yes, I had it hanging in my bedroom. I lived in Berkeley. Everybody has these in their bedroom. And some of you got that. And I looked up at, and I realized I had recently gone to an exhibit of Thangka that were exhibited by a visiting Rinpoche from Tibet, and he had displayed his collection of Thangka to help people understand Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. And so I went to it, and it was a very interesting experience because I was looking at one of these and studying it and looking at every, you can see all the immense detail in these paintings. There's just so much happening, right? So much. And I as I was looking at the Rinpoche came up to me and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's beautiful." And he says, "Yes, but what do you think? What does it say to you?" Well, I'm not sure what it says to me. I mean, it's sort of beautiful, and I think it's a nice work of art. And I don't know. What am I supposed to see? What am I supposed to look at? I suppose maybe I should ask you, what does that mean? And what does this mean? And what is that? And what is this? And what is this? And this and this and this? And he said, you want to know what it means. He said, I'm not going to tell you. I said, okay. I said, all right. So he says, no. I don't mean that I'm rejecting you. I'm saying I'm not going to tell you. I want you to figure it out. And I said, I don't know how to begin. And he said, well, just stand there, be quiet, be calm, take a breath, and look at it. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And he walked away, and I stood there, took a breath, and looked at it. And a weird thing happened. It started to have some meaning, and I couldn't quite tell you exactly what the meaning was, but there was meaning. I started to feel some understanding about it. And I thought, okay, so he doesn't want to tell me what it means. I have to figure it out what it means myself. Okay, so it's somewhat subjective, I suppose. So he came back 5 minutes later. He says, what do you think? What happened? He said, well, it spoke to me. It did. It spoke to me. It spoke of power, and it spoke of danger, and it spoke of, and he's looking at me like, and he seems to be very pleased about the words that I'm saying. And I said, so am I right? And he says, I don't know. I don't know if you're right, but he says, that's what it means. To you, that's what it means. So I was thinking of that Rinpoche as I was sitting there in my bed, Sunday morning, sunny day, and looking at Ulysses that I couldn't figure out. And as I thought of that, as I looked at that thangka and I thought of that experience, I suddenly realized maybe this book is a thangka. Maybe I'm trying to figure out what everything means. Like I need the books to tell me what everything means. Maybe what I need to do is relax, calm down, take a breath, and just let myself float into the words. So I opened to page 1, and I started with the beginning, and page 10, page 30, page 120, page 350. I finished the book in 3 days. And I got it. I understood it. I figured it out. And I said, oh my God, how did I do that? Because I felt like there was no effort in reading this book. It just suddenly made sense. It's as if something floated to the surface. Some understanding of the story floated to the surface. And that became the starting point of my thesis. Okay. That's a story about research. It's about the motivation of my research. And in the motivation of my research, were you paying attention? Were you waiting to find out what was going to happen next? Or were you sitting here going, get to the point, get to the point? What were the results? In other words, is your reaction to what I just did in talking about my research, did it captivate you? Did it hold you? Or did you feel like, oh, I'm impatient. I want to know what the data was about. I want to know if your hypothesis was what the conclusion of your hypothesis was. So what happened? Did I grab you? Did I hold you? That's the power of story. And if we think about it, research is a story. E.O. Wilson, Professor E.O. Wilson, formerly of Harvard University, a great scientist, says that good science is a good story. And it's not just one story, it's many stories. Think about the research. If you're doing research, think about the research you're doing, and think about the stories created from the research, about the research, as a result, outside of the research, stories about you in the research, others in the research, stories related to the research, a big cast of characters, a lot of events, a lot of things are happening. So research is potentially a story event or many-storied event. So I want us to consider that today as we go forward and look at what you might do with a 3-minute thesis. Because keep in mind that the 3-minute thesis is an unusual event. You're not being asked to give an academic presentation. This is a presentation that bridges the academic world with the public world. And so not only are you communicating it in language that people understand, but you've got to find a way to get into the people's minds and make them understand in a certain way, to make the ideas that you're presenting explode in their head. And one really great way to do that is with story. Okay, so welcome to, and glad to see you all here. I mean, it's great to see so many people here today. How many, I'm curious, maybe some of you were already asked this question, but I came in late. How many of you are here today from our partner universities? Anyone from our partner universities, Shida or anywhere outside? Are we all tie-da in here? We're all tie-da. Well, great, excellent, that's fine. So I'm very glad to have you here. How many of you are, I'm just curious just to see a little bit of a blend. How many of you are in some kind of engineering? Okay, lots of engineers. They're always here. All right, engineers. And how many of you are in the applied sciences? The applied sciences? Life sciences? Life sciences, great. And how many of you are in in social sciences? Social sciences. Okay. Oh, nice to see several hands go up. And humanities. Anyone in the humanities in here? Do I have any humanities? No? All right. All right. It's a good idea. What else do I have? How many law students do I have? Great. All right. Law. Great. And how many political science people are in here today? Political science, national development? No, they're out being political, I guess, right now. Okay. All right. I'm just curious to see who's in here today and what the potentials are for story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the elements of story and help you understand how the elements of story could be applied to a presentation. And then I want to give you some examples of what I'm talking about as well. I'm going to show you a 3MT winner from a few years back from Australia, who I think is a very good example of what I'm talking about today. So I'm going to show you that as an example as well, so you'll see how to maybe apply some of the things that I'm presenting. Now, for today, feel free. This is a very relaxed presentation. I've started out rather formally with my talk about my story of research, but feel free at any time to interrupt me and ask questions or ask for clarification. Please go ahead and do that. I very much would welcome that. Okay? All right. Well, so E.O. Wilson, Dr. Wilson, good science is a good story, and in fact that's true. And we would say with the word story or storytelling, there's two words to that, right? Story and telling. So when you consider that there is a story there, and in the delivery of that story, it is told. It is spoken or written. And in this case, we're looking at how it is spoken, how it is presented to the audience. So we want to consider here today about the idea of, in the presentation of your research ideas, if you can turn any part of that into story, what is your story? What is your story? I want you to think about the potential for story in the work that you're doing. Now, just as a little bit of giving credits here, the work that I'm presenting today is based on the work of Kendall Haven. And Mr. Haven is a former scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Lab in California. And he is an interesting man. He was a major scientist pursuing Lawrence Livermore Lab. You know, I mean, that's a pretty serious institute right there. And he got interested in storytelling by having to entertain his girlfriend's little boy. And he got curious about why do children, for example, who otherwise don't pay attention because they're running and playing and they're being kids, how is it when you tell stories to children, they stop moving? And they're like this. And he noticed not only children, but everybody does that. We are somehow, he felt, somehow attracted to story, and he wasn't sure why at first, why that was. He's thinking scientifically. Why? What attracts us to story? He's referring to an experience he had in Berkeley, I think where he was at the time, in a park in Berkeley, California, and where he was taking care of the kid, and to get the kid to be quiet, telling him stories, and every time he took him to the park, more kids started to come around and saying, tell us a story. So he sort of became the guy telling the story. And then parents were looking over there and what's going on with our kids? And they kind of came over and they saw that he was telling them stories, which he was just making up. They weren't stories. He was just trying to, he's trying to keep the kid quiet. So he was making up crazy stories. But even the adults started to come over, the parents, and suddenly he found he always had a crowd around him. And that fascinated him so much, he quit being a scientist and became a professional storyteller. This might happen to you, I don't know. Who knows? All right. All right, so a little background that we need to just understand storytelling in the context of its place in our minds. We know that reading and writing and logic all started, or all began, or it was all pretty much formed a few thousand years ago, which in the history of the universe, that's just nothing. That just was very recently where all these things happened. So we have all of these ways of communicating and ways of thinking, but curiously, storytelling is estimated to have begun 100,000 years ago. 100,000 years ago. In the earliest development of speech, story was one of the primary ways to communicate values, to communicate experience, to communicate instruction. It was a learning tool. It was a thinking tool. It was a way to hold together families and societies and to establish understanding of the world around us as an effect. So we can probably argue here that since storytelling has been around much longer than reading and writing and logic, our brains are probably a bit more hardwired for story structures. And the fact that if you felt in the beginning that, as I told you the story of the motivation, the story of my experience of discovering my thesis, of the beginning of my thesis ideas, I noticed as I was saying it that I was somehow holding you. And I'm not taking credit for myself. I'm not saying that arrogantly, like, aren't I a good storyteller? Oh. No, I'm not. I'm saying something in the telling of story is holding you, is captivating you. Something in the story itself, the structure of the story. And so in the motivation and in the goals and in the obstacles and in the information that was given contextualized as a story, you were somehow, your brain was going, and there's probably, if we turned you on to an fMRI in there's probably a lot of lights flashing during the time that you're hearing the story. Compare that to a lecture on a subject in your field, and the lecturer is standing there, maybe with PowerPoint, and telling you technical information, logical information. You may also have it in front of you so you can read it. And so you've got all of these things. You've got bullet points and lists and data and information. And if we turn on the fMRI, when that's happening, well, there are lights on, definitely, but not as many lights as if when there are stories. So I want us to consider that story has the potential for being an extremely useful vehicle for communicating anything that you do, anything that you experience. Because we know that the brain is predisposed. This is the work of Dr. Kendall Haven did the cognitive research, and he has a book out on this, and as many others have. The brain is predisposed to understand, to make sense, to remember, and to make connections through story structure. Story structure. Now, I want us to look at how that might be and how that's possible. Well, let's go back 100,000 years. There we go. Let's go back to the early days of story. Og was hungry. Og saw a mastodon roaming in the forest. The elements of a story. Now, here's an interesting thing. Can I ask you, you see these elements of a story. What are you doing right now with this information? Can anyone tell me what you're experiencing? What's happening right now in your mind with these two little tiny elements of story? Think inside. What's going on in here? Are you asking questions? Are you predicting? Are you connecting? Do you understand this? Og was hungry. Og saw a mastodon. What do those two things have in common? What do they have in common? Og was hungry. Og saw a mastodon roaming in the forest. What do they have in common? What's their relationship? Og is? Right, yeah. But what's the relationship between hungry and mastodon roaming in the forest? Og hungry, mastodon, dinner. Yes. And I just explained that, but did I need to explain that? I didn't, did I? Right, okay. This is my point. I didn't need to explain that. This is the power of story right away. Usually when we are delivering information of a technical or a scientific nature, quite often we feel that we must deliver a very heavy load of detail, a lot of data, a lot of analysis, a lot of facts and information. And yet, in this case right here, and this is of course not scientific information, but just a simple demonstration of how you were able to draw a connection between A and B, Og hungry, Og sees mastodon equals dinner. And you knew that connection. And there's probably a lot more things happening than just that simple connection. There's an understanding here. Are you able to predict? What's next? What's next? Og is hungry. Og sees mastodon running in forest. Og is going to hunt and kill mastodon. Yes, and bring home meat for Og wife and Og kids. Right. Yes. So you may be predicting that. Is that actually the same thing? Are you all predicting the same thing? Are you? Are you? You're all saying he's going to hunt and kill the mastodon. Wait a minute, but I see some heads nodding. Is that true for all of you? Are you predicting the same next thing or a possible other thing? Anybody thinking something differently? All right. Excellent. That's good. Okay, and you illustrate my point here. The power of story allows you, the listener, to fill in the information. You are using your reasoning, your knowledge, your background, your ability to connect through cause and effect, through comparison, through all of the learned skills, the cognitive skills that you have, to apply to this situation. And you can make this situation as simple or as complex as you want, right? Og was hungry. Og saw Mastodon roaming in the forest. Og wondered if Mastodon was good. Og never tasted Mastodon before. You know, I mean, you could really start to create some interesting complexities just by even predicting where this is going to go, right? Okay, but here's my point. You're doing a 3-minute thesis, and you've only got 3 minutes to do this, and so that means you're not going to be able to tell the audience a lot of things about your research, about your ideas. You're not going to be able to present really, certainly not in any detail, your methods, your data, your analysis of the data, or your hypothesis and your conclusions, things like that. You might be able to do it in a very limited way, but the problem of presenting that information in a what we call fundamental style, which just means here are the facts, here's what we know, let me tell you, let me just give you information, let me report information to you, that won't be delivered very effectively to the audience and to the judges, as much as if you could find a way to put it into story context, story structure. All right, so the idea here is that you are able to, as listeners, you are able to find connections, you are able to make sense out of information that is told in a story structure. We say that human minds, again, Mr. Haven, human minds automatically assume a connection and assume it makes sense and use story structures to fill in the missing information. This is an interesting phenomenon that Mr. Haven also observed with scientists, is that very often the lectures that you have in your classrooms or at conferences, if they're in a presentation, that are delivered very factually, very fundamentally, many of you, perhaps if you are trying to connect with the information, many of you may be converting that information into story. In other words, it's being presented to you as fact, but you are trying to understand it by turning it into narrative. So, and how are you doing that? Well, a very simple way is, so the guy up there is talking to me and he's trying to tell me about this idea that he has, and he thinks that this idea could solve this problem. So you're narrating in your head. You're analyzing through, very likely analyzing through story structure. You're converting. That's just again to show you how powerful story is. But my point is that why make the audience work so hard? Why does the audience have to convert the information into story? Why don't you tell them the story and then let them work more creatively, get the creative juices and the deeper understanding of the ideas and the implications and the possibilities of the ideas by telling them in a story structure. That's what we want to have happen. So, your mind in action, yes. Og was hungry. Og saw a mastodon roaming in the forest. Hi, Og! Shh! Don't make any sudden moves. Look over there. Og, it's okay. We already caught one of those yesterday when you were out fishing. So many outcomes, so many possibilities for the way the story goes. But it's very, very important that the audience is allowed to think that way. We are not trying to force our audience to think in one particular way. We're presenting or sharing ideas. And every single person in the audience is hearing your ideas, but they are formulating and understanding it based on their own experience, their own understanding, their own basis of knowledge. And they, as I said, they are also converting what you're saying. If it's very fundamentally delivered, more technically delivered, you are very likely converting this into story, into narrative. All right, so that's where we stand, and that's the case that I want to make for using story. So let's put it into a little more practical situation. So here are some story elements that might be research story elements. All the plants in the experiment died. I wanted to study fruit flies. The patient developed cancer and was treated. Again, just 3 tiny elements of 3 possible research stories. Think for a moment what your brain is doing with this information. Are you aware of the potential of this information to become a story? And one way to know that is, do any of these three sentences make you curious? For example, why did the plants die? Oh, let me tell you. I'll tell you a story. I wanted to study fruit flies. Fruit flies? What's so special about fruit flies? Let me tell you a story. The patient developed cancer and was treated. Well, you know, one thing, anyone in here involved in medical research, clinical or medical research, health policies, things like that? Okay. So though any of you who are medical people especially will know this. Medicine is a story-driven profession. It's one of the story-driven professions. Doctors and nurses communicate through story. Why is the patient screaming? Well, okay, yesterday we did, okay, why is the patient in pain? What did we do for this patient? It's all narrative-driven. It's not the only field that's like that, but medicine is one of them. Social work is another. Anything with human subjects tend to be very naturally story-driven. But that doesn't mean that I want to exclude the rest of you who are working with mice, or plants, or fruit flies, or butterflies, or any other types of phenomenon, because there's stories in that as well. Because there's the story of you and that thing. The story of me and James Joyce's Ulysses. Right? This is one of the characters in my story. So let's consider, therefore, the potential for telling a story is, as audience, you hear a story and you are able to make a connection with the information you already know, experiences you had. You are satisfied with incomplete. You don't need me to tell you what it means or what everything is. I can leave parts that are blank, and you can fill those in. You can figure out what's probably missing. And remember, what you think is missing will probably be different. If we go across and say, what do you think is missing? What do you think is missing? And you might get some very different reactions to that. And that's normal and that's good, because that is showing that people are analyzing things on their own terms. And in any presentation, I will tell you, particularly presentations, we want the audience to analyze what we're telling them on their own terms. Again, we are not forcing the audience to say, this is what it is in black and white terms. Please do not change my information. No, you can't do that to the audience. The audience is going to change the information and apply it to their own experience and apply it to their own understanding of the world. That's normal and it's fine, because you are telling them also your own understanding of the world. You are presenting your own version of the story. You also assume the characters, the people involved, and the cause and effect that's occurring in the story. You are aware of the goals and the motives, and certainly should be aware of any struggles or obstacles or danger that is happening. And you may also be aware of emotional states in the story as well, as you hear the story. So as I told you the story of my journey into my research, you may have been aware of most of or all of these things. Your story brain was firing away in different parts of the brain with this kind of information. And that's a really good thing if that's happening. That's a really good thing. So keep this in mind as we go forward. Story is the root form of all narratives. It is the quintessential intrinsic base of all human communication. Story. So if you apply story structure to what you are trying to communicate to us, it is very, very likely that I will remember what you told me. Which is, in a sense, if you take my presentation class, it's one of the first premises that I make for presenters. And tell me if you agree. Some of you are already, I see familiar faces who've heard this already in here. But one of the first premises that I make is that that the basic goal of any presentation is to cause the audience to remember the information. Do you agree? The basic goal of any presentation is to cause the audience to remember the information. Now, I know some of you are going, yeah, but I never remember presentations. Well, I wonder why. I wonder why that could be. Maybe because they are structured in a way that don't let you remember. You walk out the door and your brain is as empty as it was when it came in, perhaps. Who knows? But the idea here is that we need to find a way to get our audiences to remember. And one of the most effective, proven ways to do that, established 100,000 years ago, is tell them the information in the context of story. Now, please keep in mind, as I'm not referring to story as fiction necessarily. I'm talking about structure here. I'm not talking about genre. I'm in the literature department. I mean, I'm a literature scholar. I'm not talking about the genres of literature, comedy and tragedy and science fiction and all that. No. I'm not worried about that. I'm looking at structure. And I want to show you what I mean by structure. So the central thesis of what we're going to talk about today is that story architecture provides strong, maybe superior ability to remember, improved understanding. It gives very effective context for the information. It creates empathy with the audience. And this is a very major part that's missing from a lot of academic style presentations is we don't care because you didn't make us care. Because you're just presenting data, but why should we care? So you want to add to the elements through story effectively to create empathy. And of course, story makes you pay attention better. You don't feel yourself drifting over to, where's my Candy Crush? Must play Candy Crush, brain is dead. We'll now play, yeah. You don't want that to happen because, well, story will prevent that from happening. And then, of course, story also enhances meaning. You can give definitions, but those are neutral, dry pieces of information. If information is contextualized and meaning is contextualized through story, it becomes alive. It becomes electric. Okay. So what is story? Well, I mean, I keep referring to story, because I know still some of you might be skeptical, and I accept that. You're all thinking in different levels about this. Story. Some of you are saying, for example, oh, well, Marc, it's a good idea, story. Yeah, I like your idea, but, my professor will never accept this. Can never do that in front of my professor. Okay, so that's one thing I hear. Or story, well, I don't have enough time to present my data if I tell a story. Oh, really? Okay. So I've heard a lot of different excuses of why story can't work in an academic or scientific or technical presentation. But I think I want to try to persuade you that that might not be true. That actually I think it can work, and it can work very well in different ways. Not always in the same way. If you want to consider the idea that, if you want to consider how a story sticks, meaning how a story is memorable, let's compare story with all of these things. A journal article, an essay, a Wikipedia entry, a memo, recipe, poem, set of instructions, a conversation, a newspaper column, or a joke. What does story have that's different from these kinds of information, these kinds of communication? You can add email to that. Any idea? How about let's use a journal article, because that's the most common piece of communication we work with in this room, right? Journal articles. So how is a journal article different from a story? What are you aware of when you read a journal article? What are you aware of while you read a journal article? What are you paying attention to?
The research method and the causal relation.
Exactly. Okay, that stuff, right? That stuff. the data, the methods, right? The information. And if we could just sort of create a general classification for all that, you're paying attention to what? Those things are words. You're paying attention to the words. You're trying to get meaning out of the words. That's what I was doing. I was trying to get meaning out of words. I wasn't letting the story come through. I didn't think the story was there and it couldn't come through. But the journal articles works the same way. In fact, Marc Turner, who is a linguist and has done some interesting work with looking at how the brain works on, for example, story, he notes that a journal article is a story that is buried. It's not there, but it is there. But you're not allowed to tell it, because the journal article contextualizes words in a certain way to deliver information in a certain way that is not necessarily narrative. It is methodologically arranged. It is designed in a certain way to deliver information in a particular way where you would concentrate on numbers and words and figures and equations and whatever, right? And so you are aware of those words. But when you are experiencing story, even though words are there, words are not at the top of the list of what you're aware of. Certainly you are hearing words or seeing words in a narrative, but your brain is saying, yeah, we hear the words, but we're really responding to something else, deeper than just the words. So that's why maybe when you read journal articles, after about 3 or 4 journal articles, maybe you start to feel really tired, because you're fighting against your brain's natural tendency to want to know a good story out of this. And I have to say there's a little bit of exception maybe in this room. My social science people are sometimes benefiting from journals and from research that's written more narratively, possibly. But for the rest of us, the engineers and the scientists in the room, perhaps we're more likely to see empirical research formation of information. So we get brain tired more quickly. And wouldn't it be nice if all the journals that you're reading were written as stories? Would you enjoy them more? Would you? Some of you say, yeah, you can say no to that. That's okay. I'm not saying that you must. But the idea, let's just consider that for a moment. Journal articles may be written as narratives, as an experience that a researcher or research team has an experience going through the process of formulating and discovering and trying to figure out some phenomenon, some solution to a problem, told not in that very dry, neutral, non-narrative sense, but told as an experiential event. Would that make the journal articles more interesting for you? Do you think you could read more of them and get more value out of them? Actually, Dr. Haven would say that. He would say that if you were reading journal articles as stories, if they were written that way, your retention of that information would be higher. And as it is, the way we read journal articles is because it's so it goes against our brain's intuition for story structure. It works against our thinking. That's why we have highlighting and underlining and stars and checks and annotations. That's why we have to make so many marks all over the paper, because it's not a story. I need to remember where that information is. And if I look in, when I first started, I think I've erased these things. When I first started reading James Joyce, even, which is not a journal article, of course. No, I erased them all. The first 10 pages were filled with marks, underlines, highlights, all these things in here. I totally erased them, or most of them at this point, because the story, suddenly I figured out there's a story in here, and I found where it was. But anyway, that's my point. When the story comes through, we are able to connect with the information more effectively. So story doesn't refer to the content, because when you tell your research story has the same elements as your journal article does, or your thesis, or whatever you're referring to. It has the same ingredients, potentially, but the structure is different, the framework is different, and the organization is different. You are not saying, let me tell you my methods, and then I'll give you the results, and then I'll tell you what the results mean, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts. That's a standard academic structure for a research project. But here, if you're saying, so I want to tell you, first of all, how I discovered this problem and what happened to me in the process of trying to make it work, and some of the problems we had, and then finally the discoveries that we made. Oh, now, when I say it that way, I'm actually not saying it so differently from methods, results, and discussion, but I'm framing it now in story. I'm going to say this is now a story. This is not a methods, results, discussion format. So story guides the interpretation of, story guides the creation of meaning from, story controls the memory of your information, your concepts, and your facts, your data. It can do that. So you're not presenting your current best information if you're telling it as a story. Your goal as a storyteller of your research experience is to have listeners understand, have the listeners remember, and apply that information to affect their beliefs and their thinking. That's real persuasion. That is real persuasion. That is organic, grade A, superior persuasion. And that requires memorable stories. All right, so now let me show you the 8 elements of a story that can be used in telling your own research story. Here they are: character, character traits, goal and motive, conflicts and problems, risks and dangers, struggles, and details. These are the 8 essential elements of any story that you tell. So let's start with number 3, goal. So what is goal? Goal is what the main character in your story needs or wants, what they want to achieve. Purpose. Reason why. So, I wanted to study fruit flies. That's a goal. That's a goal. And that's a starting point, perhaps. Maybe. It doesn't have to be the beginning of the story, but it is stated. So, when you're stating the goal, you're not telling us what someone does. I study fruit flies. No. And you're not telling us what someone has accomplished. I successfully studied fruit flies. No. And but what you are telling us is what thing, what goal, what solution are you after? Is the main character after? I wanted to study fruit flies to understand the genetic makeup of their DNA. Now we have, although that sounds quite scientific and factual, maybe, that's okay. Nothing wrong with that, because already, potentially, if our story minds are turned on, we're thinking, first question might be, well, why do you want to do that? Sounds boring. Fruit flies. No, in fact, fruit flies are quite amazing. And let me tell you how I discovered that. Okay, so there's the story. There is a story. Here's a story. She was seeking a solution to heat stress on crops such as rice, millet, and wheat caused by climate change. But all the plants in her experiment died. So we have a goal, and immediately we also have some kind of event that stops her goal, a little conflict. All the plants in her experiment died. But there's our goal. And in the 3-minute thesis, one of the things that you must tell us is why you are doing this. Research, whatever it is you're doing, you must tell us why. But you could tell us in a very scientific, very dry, very neutral way, the purpose of our research is to blah, blah, blah. Yes, you can do it that way. It's okay. It's fine. But why don't you frame that a little more into a story? It's because what often goes with purpose is motivation. It's not just what I'm trying to do, but what has inspired me or stimulated me to do it. What's caused me to do it. So we often say that goal and motivation can go hand in hand. Second, conflicts, problems. So anything that blocks your character from doing something, from achieving, from succeeding, even if it's temporary, that is a conflict or a problem. The problem can also be in a bigger sense. You don't have to be the character in your story. Someone else can be the character in your story. Or the character could be a large group or a group of people. You're trying to solve a problem for some people. So maybe the characters are other people. But whatever it is that whether you are the character or someone else is the character, there's going to be a conflict or a problem. Let me say right here that you cannot tell a story without a conflict. Well, I suppose you could, but it's not an interesting story. Because think of every story you've ever seen, every movie you've seen, every TV show. There is a conflict. A small conflict, a big conflict, there's a conflict. So, she was seeking a solution to heat stress on crops such as rice, millet, and wheat caused by climate change, but all the plants in her experiment died. And she couldn't figure out why. She had followed the method carefully. Was her hypothesis wrong? Conflicts, problems. Number 3, risks and danger. Really? You're thinking right now maybe, oh, wait a minute, I'm just sitting in a laboratory all day. There are no risks and dangers, me sitting and being very bored, waiting for something to happen in my laboratory experience. Well, okay. First of all, think about the elements of risk and danger is that they create something called suspense. They create a kind of, it causes the audience to go, oh, that happened? Oh my God, what happened next? And so you know you've seen really good movies that have suspense, where something happens to the character, and then you feel a kind of anxiety and wonder about what's the consequence, what's the result of that event that's happened to the character. So risks and dangers, that's what it does. It's the danger, risk is the probability of failure, danger is the consequences of failure. Can it be contextualized into a simple research experiment or a research project? Well, I think so, because first of all, problems and conflicts and risk and danger are always present in our life. We might not know they're always there, but they are there. And they do not necessarily always mean they're talking about failures. They're often related or contextualized as challenges, something you have to face. All the plants died. What's wrong? Okay, end of story? No, hardly the end of the story. We need to find out what's going on. So the idea here is that when you're talking about risk and danger, it doesn't mean physical. It doesn't have to mean physical danger. It doesn't mean that your life is threatened. It can just be something simple, an emotional danger, a mental danger, social danger, a professional danger. It doesn't need to be a physical danger. So, what happened to our experiment? It can be related to embarrassment, rejection, lack of knowledge and understanding, lack of information, failure, of course, losing, being fearful. Sometimes these are the best dangers. The conflicts can also be external and they can be internal. In other words, you could be facing a challenge that's up here, not out there. So these are all elements that you can add. She was seeking a solution to heat stress on crops such as rice, millet, and wheat caused by climate change, but all the plants in her experiment died. She couldn't figure out why. She had followed the method carefully. Was her hypothesis wrong? She was facing failure. Time was running out. If she wanted to graduate this year, she needed this experiment to succeed. Risks and dangers, conflicts and problems. Number 4, struggle. Perhaps I would say the two most important elements of any story, one, conflict, has to be there, and then one that is quite useful and necessary is struggle. How you face the challenge, what you decide to do to face the conflict or face the problem. And this is, again, not a hard thing to do because for many of you, you have research projects which are problem solution based. You have identified a problem and it's affecting people in a certain way, or it's affecting something in a certain way, and you are seeking a solution, and there's the suspense. Will I find it? Will it be possible to solve this? And then you decide it's not possible, or it may be possible, or it is possible, but your approach, your struggle to finding the solution to the problem, that is the context of taking the research story and applying it into a struggle. To struggle means just simply to engage or to exert effort. It doesn't necessarily mean to oppose, right? It just means to make effort, to try. So we're seeing that in presentations and in stories in general, where there is a struggle, we find that that really grabs the audience, the listener or the reader, more effectively than a character who's not really worried about the struggle of doing something. So struggles can be, again, internal and external. You can struggle internally over a decision. You can struggle over values, sacrifice, uncertainty, over fears, or externally face struggles from your advisor or other faculty, from your family or from your peers or from experts. You have struggle against competitors, competition, over scarce resources, or how to do something. So these are all potential areas that you can use to illustrate your struggle. She was seeking a solution to heat stress on crops such as rice and millet and wheat caused by climate change, but all the plants in her experiment died. She couldn't figure out why. She had followed the method carefully. Was her hypothesis wrong? She was facing failure. Time was running out. If she wanted to graduate this year, she needed this experiment to succeed. But she was determined to find a solution. She began the experiment again. All right. Struggle. Facing the situation. She's deciding to face the challenge. She's going to graduate this year. We put that connection together, right? Number 5, details. Well, so now details are certainly the elements, the environmental and also mental elements, the ways of describing what's going on inside and outside around the characters. And they can obviously add color and feeling to this. When I was telling you my story about trying to read James Joyce, I said, I'm lying in my bed on a lazy Sunday wishing I could go outside, the sun is shining. So I'm giving you details. And do those details enhance what's happening to me? They should. That's the purpose of details. They enhance my frustration of reading this book. But if I just said, I was lying in bed, I was trying to read, I couldn't read it. Not that vivid, is it? But I was lying in my bed on a sunny Sunday morning, and the birds were singing, the sun was shining, and I wanted to go outside, but no. I needed to read this book. Now we have details making the events of the story more vivid. Now, for the purpose, I don't have an example of details in this one right here yet. I'll show you in a moment. Obviously, for the purposes of a 3-minute thesis, it's possible to turn the whole thing into a whole story in 3 minutes, I think. But it's also maybe something where you might want to consider a very brief story or a couple of brief stories inserted into the 3-minute text that goes along with the other information that you're presenting. So details might actually add time to what you're talking about. So although I think details are really important in a story, they may not be possible in the 3-minute thesis format, but keep these in mind for a longer presentation. Number 6, motive. So motive, very important because it explains why the goal is important. Motives control how the audiences relate to the character. So motivation. This for me is, I think, the most interesting part of a research story. It's not just why you're doing the research, but what inspired the research. What caused you to do it? Now, maybe not all of you have a really interesting motivation. Maybe, actually, mine wasn't very interesting. My motivation for doing the research was my advisor told me to do it. And I think some of you have that motivation too. So maybe that's not the most exciting motivation, but you can find other motivation. In fact, I found motivation in the frustration of not reading this, but I was determined. In other words, through my struggle, I found motivation. So the idea of finding motivation for your character will enhance the character's reason for facing conflicts. So here's details and motives added together. She was seeking a solution to heat stress on crops such as rice, millet, and wheat caused by climate change, but all the plants in her experiment died. As she gazed upon the withered supercrops she had believed would be her great discovery, she couldn't figure out why. She had followed the method carefully. Was her hypothesis wrong? She was facing failure. Time was running out. If she wanted to graduate this year, she needed this experiment to succeed. As she looked distractedly out the lab window at the carefree students playing sports and enjoying themselves, she felt like crying, like giving up. So details and motive. Finally, the last two, character and character traits. So it's very likely, and I think it's quite acceptable in presenting research ideas, to make yourself the main character. I think the audience is interested in how you as a human being, as a person with experience and thoughts and ideas, connects with the abstract world of the research you're doing. So normally when you're writing a journal article, we talked about the journal article buries the story, and part of that story is your story. Very rarely do you get to say in the introduction to your research, you don't get to say in the introduction, I began my research by an interesting experience that I had with my family. No, sorry, can't do that. No, not possible. No, you need to say, cancer is the second leading cause of death worldwide, or something very neutral and very dry, something very acceptable to the journal, of course. But in the presentation, the rules can be broken because it is a presentation. It's a live event. And to some extent, in presentations, audiences want to be stimulated. I almost said entertained, but I know there are scientific people in the room and they'll go, what? Fun? No fun. No, well, I know you're saying that from your conditioning, but in a certain sense, we do want to be stimulated in a presentation. We want to feel not just that we're receiving information, but the information is delivered in a way that excites us, that interests us, that allows us to share what joy or what passion or interest you have. So character does that. Now, in one of my classes, I go into Jungian psychology. If there's anyone in psychology in here? Any psychology people? No? Jungian. Carl Jung, this is a Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century, developed Jungian psychology, and based on a concept called archetypes. He says that we are all pursuing our lives as a big story, and that we're fulfilling our destinies through particularly one type of archetype. And this is the archetypal wheel of the Jungian archetypes. And so what I do in one of my classes is I say, what's your life story? Who are you? Are you the hero? Are you the caregiver? Are you the outlaw? Are you the ruler? Who are you in your story? And in a certain sense, if you want to tell your story in a presentation context, I think it's helpful to, behind the story, to give your character, yourself, recognize what it is that motivates your character to do what they do. Maybe you're driven to be a caregiver because the lover and the caregiver and the everyman is driven to be social. The jester, the outlaw, the explorer, seeking freedom. The hero, the creator, the hero, and the magician, ego-driven. And the sage, the ruler, and the innocent are order-driven. Who are you in that sense? That's probably going to be naturally communicated in the way you tell a story, but it helps for you to identify that for yourself or for your character if it's not you. What is their basic motivation in their character trait? How are they seeing the world and how are they moving through the world? So in this case, let me just skip down to this part here. She says, she looked distractedly out the lab window at the carefree students playing sports and enjoying themselves. She felt like crying, like giving up. But she quickly realized, I'm not the type who gives up easily. When faced with a challenge, I always meet it face on. Failure was not part of her vocabulary. So, well, that's pretty aggressive. So she sounds like the hero, possibly. Or maybe the magician. Maybe she's going to be transformative in some way. But it sounds like she's thinking, I am not this way. I am this way. I have power. I am a Marvel comic superhero. Right? That's how she's seeing herself. So that is hero, is ego. Okay. So those are the 8 elements. The 8 elements of the story. You have your main character. Is it you? Is it the subjects that you're studying? Is it people affected by a problem? The characters can be whoever you want. What are the character traits that make them interesting? Give them some personality. Don't make them just, in most cases, you don't want to make them just neutral. What's your goal? Or what is the character's goal? And what is the motive behind that goal? So you're saying the purpose of my research is, I'm studying this because I want to find this out. And the reason I want to find this out is because this idea occurred to me because, or I had this experience. What conflicts or problems have you had? And what are the risks? What were the risks and the dangers? Remember, they don't have to be physical. And what struggle did you go through to face the challenge? And finally, are there any details, even small details? It don't have to be lengthy, long details. You don't have to write like a French novelist or something like that. You can just write brief details, just adjectives and nouns that might enhance the story a little bit. So what we mean by story, therefore, is that story is a character-based narrative account of a character's struggle to overcome obstacles and reach a defined and important goal, presented in sufficient detail to make the story real, vivid, and memorable. And boy, doesn't that sound like a definition of research as well? In a certain way, research is an account of a struggle to overcome an obstacle and reach a goal. So in a lot of ways, research and story are in the similar family, I think, and are closely related. A short version is, story is characters at war with an external or internal force or forces. That's the brief definition of story. Okay. So here's a framework to work with if you wanted to set up a kind of an outline or a framework. The character needed what? Because, but, so, and finally. There is your framework of what we just presented today, what we just talked about. I needed to really understand James Joyce because I felt the challenge of understanding this book would help me understand the period of modern literature in which it was written. My thesis question was to examine the idea that, did James Joyce write a verbal tanka? That was my thesis. It was. But James Joyce is very hard to read. And there were several Joycean scholars who thought my idea was crazy. And I had to fight through that. But finally, I found that my hypothesis had great validity. Ah, there's a story. Okay. Marc Turner, whose book I mentioned earlier, just to remind you that fact is made relevant by turning it into story. You can present facts, and surely it's one way to present. You can present facts, but by turning facts into story, by creating a narrative structure around information, data, facts, methods, you create something which is more interesting and more likely to be remembered. And in the moment of hearing, of course, too, let me say that the audience will be greatly stimulated by that. Just a brief example. This would be maybe a way that many people might start a presentation on a scientific topic. Parkinson's disease is a crippling neurodegenerative disorder which is characterized by blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, that sounds very scientific, and it sounds very professional, too. I don't deny that. But maybe if the story began with, my mother was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and she gradually developed a tremor in her left hand. And at first it didn't disturb her too much, but increasingly she started to walk more slowly and unsteadily, and then she started losing sleep and became depressed and tired all the time. Now, my mother was always a very optimistic and cheerful person, and so it was very difficult to see her like this. But as a medical researcher, I knew what to expect. Increasing muscle rigidity, slurred speech, depression. I didn't want this to happen to my mother, and yet there is no known cure for Parkinson's. Still, it was therapeutically possible to alter some of the symptoms, sometimes dramatically. So we experimented with an innovative and unusual approach. Using a standing exercise bike, it was theorized that the repetitive movements of cycling might stabilize the symptoms affecting motor control in Parkinson's sufferers. So we bought a standing exercise bike and had Mother use it every day. Well, amazingly, she not only started to regain motor control and had better sleep, but her bright, cheery smile had returned. And she even started cooking again. So how did this happen? That is contextualizing fact into story. And in that story, that brief, what we call anecdote, is characters, goals, motivation, obstacles, struggle, details, character traits. It's all there. It's all there. Just in that brief little presentation. Instead of describing what Parkinson's disease is in scientific terms, I contextualized it as an experience. Now, it doesn't need to be a personal experience. You can make it into, in fact, you can make it fictional. It doesn't need to, this is not meant to be evidence. It's meant to be illustration. It's designed to help people understand what Parkinson's is. So whether this is true or not is irrelevant. What's important here is that if I explain Parkinson's disease in scientific terms, so that it's a neurodegenerative disorder characterized by muscle rigidity, a tendency for a slow bradykinesis, slow movements and pacing, slurred speech, blah, 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 you might try to be writing that down and remembering that. But if I told you in the story, you probably wouldn't even write it down because your brain would go, I'll remember that. I'll remember that because I remember the story of that poor mother whose son found a solution for alleviating the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That's called a story arc, by the way, and the story arc is simply that, where you begin with the story by telling us what it is you're doing and the conflict that you have, building up the tension to the climactic moment, which for most of us as researchers is the point of discovery, the point of success in the research. And then from the point of success or discovery or whatever, the aha moment, it goes down into the consequences and finally into the conclusion or the resolution. That's called a story arc. And a story arc is the basic structure of the story, moving from what I'm trying to do and what obstacles I have in my way, and maybe I push through those obstacles, and then I succeed or I don't succeed, and then the consequences of that, and resolution, returning to the status quo, as we say. Okay. Stories require struggles. We need to see struggle. Most often, it's an important part of the story. We won't appreciate the ending, the outcome, if there isn't a struggle. Think about what struggles you have in the work that you do. They don't need to be big struggles. They don't need to be great, big problems. They can be small problems, like time-related problems, or money-related problems, or parents, or husbands and wives problems or things. They could just be ordinary things, but they create a need for struggle to accomplish whatever your goal is. Stories require an interesting character, and you can be an interesting character yourself to provide that context. So consider how to make yourself interesting if you want to be the character in your story. Stories create empathy, they create context, they create relevance, connectedness. Stories create understanding and meaning, and they are memorable. They are much more memorable. And if you don't believe me, let's ask one more expert. Steve, what do you think? All right, there we go. So we start with Dr. Wilson and we end with Mr. Jobs. There's a lot of good authority of talking about the value of story. Okay, we're pretty much at the end now. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to just do briefly, because it's a 3-minute thesis, I'd like to show you the 2012 winner of the 3-minute thesis competition in the University of Queensland in Australia. The University of Queensland is the first university, the originator of this event. And I want to show you the winner of that event. His name is Matt Thompson. And Mr. Thompson is studying psychology and specializes in an area that some of you might know called forensics, which is related to what police do, right? That's what police and detectives can do. I want you just to observe this, how he uses story as part of his presentation.
So Matthew Thompson is our first finalist today. He's from the University of Queensland in the School of Psychology and National ICT Australia, Faculty of Social and Behavioural Sciences. The name of his thesis is Structure and Features in Complex Visual Stimuli, Assisting Identification in Forensics, and the short name for us here today has been translated to the 3-minute version, Suspects, Science, and CSI. Will you please make Matthew very welcome?
I used to think that when a crime was committed, the police dusted for fingerprints, put them into a computer, and up popped the driver's license for the person who committed the crime, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not that easy. Contrary to what you see on CSI, it's not computers that match prints, it's humans. This is a fingerprint examiner, and his job is to look back and forth at a pair of prints and decide whether the crime scene print matches the suspect or not. My PhD thesis is about understanding how examiners make these important decisions. In Australia alone, there are over 5,000 of these comparisons made per day to be used as evidence in convicting criminals. But occasionally, mistakes are made. In 2004, a lawyer named Brandon Mayfield was arrested by the FBI because his fingerprints matched those found on a bomb that exploded, killing 191 people. But here's the catch. The fingerprint examiners made a mistake. They matched a print to the wrong person. Mayfield was innocent. So how can this happen? Well, it turns out that despite them testifying in court for the past 100 years, fingerprint examiners had never been scientifically tested for how accurately they can match prints. In my PhD, I started by testing the accuracy of fingerprint examiners at police stations in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and the Australian Federal Police in Canberra. I put them in a situation similar to their usual work, but I maintained tight experimental control by using simulated crime scene prints in a signal detection paradigm. More simply, I wanted to find out how many guilty people were being wrongly set free and how many innocent people were being wrongfully convicted. Well, this was the first ever test of fingerprint expertise, and as you might hope, the examiners were extremely accurate, but not perfect. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw that the examiners could actually do what they claim, but the challenge now is to see how these findings translate to performance outside the lab. As well as accuracy, I'm interested in the basics of how it is that humans process complex visual patterns, such as fingerprints. I want to turn novices into experts more quickly, and I'm discovering ways of improving their accuracy. Last month, my research was presented to judges at the Supreme Court. The experiments from my PhD are changing the way we think about presenting fingerprint evidence to judges and juries. So where to from here? Well, next year I'm heading to LA to continue my research with law enforcement agencies in the US. I'll apply my fingerprint work across other areas of forensics, like shoe prints, blood spatter, and even DNA, to help ensure that innocent people are not wrongfully accused. Thank you.
Pretty good, huh? As a winner. I just wanted to point out that he uses narrative in a couple of ways. His motivation is narrative, right here. In other words, rather than tell us why he personally is interested in doing this, he's using a little story about a man who was convicted of being a bomber, but he was not the bomber. The police matched the wrong fingerprint. So there is use of story in a 3-minute thesis context because your time is limited. We could certainly turn the whole thing into a story. It's possible. In a certain way, he does. I would say most of his presentation is narrative because after this, he gets into his methods and to his results. But you notice that he talks about his methods and his results as an experience that he went through. He personalized it. He said, I did this, and this is what I thought would happen. And I breathed a sigh of relief when I found out that fingerprint examiners can do what they say they can do. So he built up a narrative arc by going through his methods and into his results. And when he hit the point of discovery was, he found out, well, maybe not so surprisingly, that fingerprint examiners are very good at their job. But that is an example of narrative arc. He is personalizing what he does all the way through to the end. He talks about going also in a narrative sense of time. What I did, what I found out, what I'm doing now, what I'll do in the future. So it's all a kind of a narrative that he's telling us. Now, it's not story in the sense of, there's two types of story. There's the narrative story of that, and then there's this thing which is called anecdote. An anecdote is this is an illustrative story. It's illustrating what he's talking about. So this is used to make a point, and then all the rest of this is designed to tell his story of his journey through the research experience and where he's going to go into the future. Are you kind of excited for Matt in a way by listening to that? Are you happy for him? Do you feel like he kind of invited you along? You sort of get that feeling, don't you? That's part of the story narrative. That's part of the story power. He's bringing you along through the experience. He's taking you there. He's taking you into the police stations where he did his testing and where he was nervous about the results. So this is all an example of story. All right. I hope you consider there are a lot of variations in creating 3-minute thesis formats. Today I showed you story structure, but story structure is highly adaptable and can be used in a lot of ways. What I'm going to do with the material I showed you today is that we're going to put it on our website. Once, how is that all right? We can put all the things I showed you today, also some information about how to create an anecdote like that. And I'm going to put all that information on our AWEC website so you can download it and refer to all the things I showed you today.